Okay, so part two of this week's content is on the alt-right. And acceleration and effective altruism. And we're going to be talking with Roger Burrows. Thanks for joining us, Roger. Can you just tell us a little about yourself and your research?
Well, I'm 61 years old. That's the first thing to say. And I'm talking to you from Bristol in the UK. I'm currently a professor in global inequalities at Bristol, but I've worked at various places, and I've got a background in sociology and urban studies.
So can you tell us a little bit, in your recent years, you've kind of turned to doing sociological research on the rise of the alt-right, the rise of the super rich, and things like that, particularly the kind of geography of the super rich in places like London as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your concerns and why you kind of turned towards that stuff?
Yeah, certainly. So, yeah, the last decade really. For a long while, I don't think sociology took the rich seriously. It was seen as a bit of an indulgence if you studied wealth. Can't imagine that to be the case now, given what's happened. Certainly post 2008 and accelerated post 2016. So I began with a bunch of other sociological colleagues to begin to study what was happening in London post the financial crash. Because it became apparent that London was changing in quite fundamental ways as global wealth began to park itself in the city. So we began to map out what was happening to the kind of core wealthy areas in London. That's now published, and we can talk about that in another session. But the two things are linked in a sense that we began to be interested in what was the kind of the ideological beliefs, or the kind of the motivating theoretical ideas behind some of these developments, and also what kind of ideologies some of these people in the super rich, especially those working in the tech sector, held. So my interest in the alt-right really came out of that, to actually try and look at the kind of the material underpinnings, I suppose, of the emergence of the alt-right, especially after 2008.
So why do you think, for instance, it seems in a way like talking about these kind of weird right-wing philosophers and the super rich, why do you think people in youth studies and young people generally should be concerned about this stuff?
Well, I think it provides the context and our futures. And I think we might be surprised. Well, you're a youth researcher, perhaps you won't be surprised just how familiar some of the ideas that we're going to discuss here are amongst young people. This is, as we'll perhaps go on to discuss, a kind of a mimetic culture. It's something that is available online, and not something you routinely find within the university or within the school.
Yep.
So it has an appeal politically to a certain fraction of young people. But more broadly, we need to understand what's happening globally in terms of the distribution of income and wealth, that the everyday lives of young people is fundamentally affected not just by tech, but about some of the material we're going to talk about.
Yep.
Post 2008, we've had a massive global redistribution of income and wealth away from those at the bottom of the income and the wealth scale towards those at the very top. And that has massive consequences for us all, but not least the new generation of people coming through, whose lives are going to be very, very different to their parents and their grandparents because of some of these structural changes globally.
Yep. So we're going to begin with talking about the NRX and the kind of rise of the alt-right and some of the actual philosophy behind that stuff. And there's some of the key characters on the screen here at the moment. Tell us a little bit about the story of the rise of this kind of intellectual part of the...
Yeah. Well, the NRX, neo-reactionaries, sometimes also called a philosophical movement called the Dark Enlightenment, is a real mishmash of influences of people from philosophy, from the tech sector, and also from a long tradition of kind of extreme neoliberal market fundamentalism. You wouldn't think initially that they would have much in common, but they've kind of coalesced, and they've probably coalesced most fundamentally around a book that was published in 1997. No one read it in the social sciences because it wasn't written for people in the social sciences. It was written for radical investors. It's a book called The Sovereign Individual, and it's written by James Dale Davidson and someone called Lord William Rees-Mogg. Now, in the UK, the name Rees-Mogg has an echo because Lord William Rees-Mogg's son, one of his sons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, is a leading Brexiteer. But this book, The Sovereign Individual, published as far back as 1997, is cited by some people in neo-reaction as their kind of philosophical source. And it provides a kind of a guide about what radical investors, wealthy people should be doing. And it's amazingly predictive, frighteningly predictive about a whole range of things, cryptocurrencies, globalism, a whole range of factors.
Yep.
But NRX itself really is an amalgam of the writings of a blogger called Mencius Mulbug, turns out to be a coder called Curtis Yarvin, who's funded by Peter Thiel, who might be known to some of your students, made his money from PayPal and Facebook,
yep.
And now is a tech investor, a libertarian who funds all sorts of kinds of activities. He funded Patrick Friedman, who's the grandson of Milton Friedman, the famous neoliberal monetarist.
Yep.
So all this was going on, and then along came this guy called Nick Land, who comes out of philosophy, quite a well-known theorist of the early days of the internet, who leaves academia, moves to China, and begins to blog about this stuff and crystallizes it around this notion of the Dark Enlightenment. So it's a mixture of things. It's a mixture of market radicalism. It's a mixture of a sense that democracy is screwed, that democratic forms are too slow and too sluggish, and that actually, I suppose if you were going to encapsulate it, this group of people believe that businesses and business models aren't just something that we should apply to commercial organizations. They are it's a set of principles that we should also apply to governance.
Yep.
So they're anti-democratic, excuse me, and they believe that we should reorganize ourselves in a more business-like manner, and rather than have democratic leaders, we should appoint chief executive officers, or even in its most extreme form, kings and queens, monarchs, to run our cities like businesses.
Yeah.
And they're interested in trying to develop new architectures which allow us not to vote, but to have market mechanisms so we can tune our own system of governance. Yeah. The trouble is that all those ideas have been quite appealing to some people. They are also associated with misogyny, racism, and something that could only be called fascism. So the amazing cultural theorist Paul Gilroy, who comes out of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies tradition, has written brilliantly recently about this group in a series of papers that link these ideas to broader problems in social systems.
Yep. Okay, so there's the alt-right is one of the kind of movements we're talking about here, and Nick Land was associated with the idea of accelerationism, along with other people in his kind of philosophy think tank at the time before he left it. Can you tell us a little bit about what accelerationism is?
Yeah, well, accelerationism is a very, very trendy idea that in a sense speaks to many of the things that concern us in this very moment, not least the emergence of things like ChatGPT and the rise of AI. To put it very crudely, accelerationism comes out of a particular reading of the philosophers Deleuze and Guattari, but takes it into a kind of a very kind of market-orientated right-wing direction. It's the idea that essentially much of what people like us engage in, people in the academy, people in welfare services, our activities are really all designed to try and dampen down or slow down something that is inherent, which is the accelerationist tendencies of capitalist processes, of market processes, that we're always trying to find ways to dampen down forms of uncompensated capitalism. And the land, this is a losing battle. We can keep trying to regulate. We can keep trying to think about developing non-commodity forms, but essentially the accelerationist tendencies of capitalism are the kind of the vital processes that underpin life on the planet. And we can keep battling on. We can keep trying to slow things down, but it always wins through in the end. market processes of commodification are, if you like, the vital energy that we're trying to kind of mitigate against, and try and think about trying to insert non-market forms into those processes. Social justice, democracy, the commons, and such like. And he says, you can have a go, but you're going to lose in the end.
Yep.
The process is all. And of course, for people like Land and the supporters of NRX, who also tend to be kind of nihilists, and also people who celebrate the power of technology, the inevitable consequence of all of this is what they call a coming singularity. The idea that humanity and the new technologies are beginning to merge in ever more profound ways every day, and they celebrate this in a way in which many of us, of course, in what they call the cathedral, the forces that try and mitigate against these forms of uncompensated capitalism are concerned with. So it's an incredibly kind of negative and frightening notion that you've got powerful philosophical forces underpinned by huge amounts of money who essentially adhere to this idea that we're fighting a losing battle and capitalism will win out in terms of its processes. And indeed, in the most extreme Landian version of this, the process is all. For him, human beings for a few centuries were the kind of the bearers of these market processes, but increasingly these value extraction systems are machinic, they're artificial intelligence, they're robotic, and the direction of travel is only in one way.
Yep.
And so there's a sort of an inevitability about this that probably will only be resolved through, for them, the inevitability of climate change and the seas rising. But then that also explains their sort of secessionary tendencies and their desire to escape.
And one of the things to escape too is the idea that you'll be able to download your consciousness into the web and live forever, isn't it? There's a kind of weirdly utopian aspect of it too, but it will only be available to certain people.
Only available to certain people, but in the meat space, in the human body, there's other secessionary architectures involving rocket ships and the colonization of Mars in the most kind of extreme, crazy versions. But then what we thought was crazy just a few years ago now looks to be a kind of a project in the kind of the Muskian version of the future. But that's accelerationism, and it's intimately tied up with neo-reaction and this idolatry of particular forms of digital technology, the inevitable winning out of artificial intelligence, and this kind of future merger, if you like, between post-human forms and technology.
Yeah, and it resonates with kind of, I suppose, postmodern social theory from a few decades ago of like Baudrillard and Virilio and the like talk about speed. Baudrillard talk about fatal strategies, the idea that we kind of, in the end, invest in our consumption and our kind of cultural dupism so much because the ultimate thing to consume is watch it all come down. There's kind of elements of that at the basis of it. It's been developed, though, more to kind of, rather than a critique of capitalism, a kind of celebration of it.
It is. I mean, in the leftist version, it really was to do with the idea that to speed up the process was the only way of causing the collapse of capitalism. But it's been given a rather different inflection now, and it's now about the celebration of that process rather than as a stratagem for the ultimate winning out of more progressive political forces.
And some on the left have kind of also taken hold of the idea as well to try and kind of move towards a different organization of society other than capitalism.
Yeah, and there's something quite interesting here, Steve, that I do think we need to pay more attention to, which is, we all say we hate metrics and measurements and all of these new things that we're subject to. But actually, within the left accelerationist framework, we might, for the first time in history, have a solution to what's sometimes called the socialist calculation problem. When the old neoliberal founders, von Mises and Hayek, were thinking through the development of neoliberal ideas, it really was in direct contradistinction to the concern about the inability of planned systems in the Soviet Union and elsewhere to deal with rational allocation of resource. We didn't have the data to be able to plan, and so for them, protecting market processes was the only way that you could actually allow an adequate allocation of resource. But what the left accelerationists are saying now is that some of the new technologies that we're living with give us real-time data from logistics and from real-time monitoring, such that maybe we don't need market processes to the extent that we did as a kind of a proxy for what we have now, which is to be able to sit here in front of a screen and to look at all of these different metrics, all these different measurements, which aren't necessarily market measurements, aren't necessarily price mechanisms, and to think about what a properly planned system might involve in terms of the real-time monitoring of data. I mean, it's not a common position, but this literature is really quite interesting in terms of thinking about the way in which the technology could be turned to more progressive ends in that way.
Another key, I think, popularist form of philosophy at the moment, it's getting a lot of play in mainstream media, is notions about long-termism and effective altruism.
Yeah.
Kind of long-termism, the idea, it's kind of philosophical idea, kind of utilitarian in a way that, like, we need to even think about future people, however distant off they are. We need to value and ensure that they get a life, which as its heart sounds quite humanist. And effective altruism is this idea that we should use these kind of reason and data and all this kind of stuff to figure out, how we can kind of do that as best as possible and spend, billionaires can be charitable and spend their money on that basis. What's interesting in this kind of calculations is that lives saved, even theoretical future ones, seem to matter more than lives today.
Yeah.
So it kind of sounds sensible in theory, but like it has all these kind of things do have these kind of predictably racist, sexist, colonialist, kind of eugenicist, kind of elitist kind of problems.
Well, and you see this being played out. I don't know whether it's been shown in Australia yet, but the TV series Succession, for instance, is playing on these things in a very popular way.
Yeah.
And if you've not seen it, you should, because in a sense, some of the characters we're talking about here feature in fictional form, and many of these ideas come to depressing fruition in terms of, and I won't put any spoilers out, but in terms of the future of the US. But underpinning all this, you're quite right, is the idea that this isn't a universalistic notion. This is really the idea that what we have seen emerging in the turn to the digital, let's say, is the emergence of a kind of a cognitive elite, a group of people who are kind of pulling away from the rest of us. And then indeed, the use of global technologies being such that actually in traditional terms of value extraction, we've got a large proportion of the global population who are surplus to requirements, whose labor is not required.
Yeah.
There was a time when their consumption was required and their debt was required, but the future now is one that's orientated towards not a kind of a global post-humanism, but a kind of a concentration of people who regard themselves as a kind of cognitive elite, who have the resource, who have the money to engage in activities which lead to a kind of a set of radical outcomes. But Steve, I don't think you can disassociate lots of these tendencies from the climate crisis and the assumption that we do face a kind of a tipping point, a kind of a catastrophe where the planet is no longer going to be able to sustain a significant proportion of the current numbers of humans.
And many of these billionaires know this, don't they? And they're kind of inventing or supporting these philosophies so they can kind of essentially colonize the future.
Well, very, very much so. Again, the cultural representations in movies like Don't Look Up point to exactly these sorts of processes.
Yeah, and so and the heart of this too is that billionaires and the like can charitize their way out of these problems and fix problems by giving money. And I'm just putting this up there as a kind of, I've showed this in other classes as well, the tiny percentage of wealth that these people give away. And Lindsay McGoey has written quite well about this.
Of course, but they don't like taxation because it's democratic.
Yeah.
And you've got to look at what they're investing in. Some of those people are fascists. Some of those people are kind of market radicals, and they're investing their money. Thiel being the case in point, but I see you've got the Cox there as well. In essentially neo-reactionary prototypes that will encourage the sorts of tendencies that we're looking at. Thiel put billions into something called the Seasteading Institute to try and build, cities on the sea.
Yep.
In anticipation of,
Yep.
of the processes that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of end this part of the lecture with this here as kind of, it really shows that these ideas aren't just ideas, they're actually thoroughly, I suppose, informing the way that kind of the super rich think about the world. And Douglas Rushkoff wrote a opinion piece about his experience going to talk to these people as a kind of tech expert. Yeah. And he's turned that into a book of Survival of the Richest. It's well worth checking out. He talks about going to this room where he thought he was going to give a speech. He finds he's only talking to 4 or 5 rich white men, and they start asking him these questions about when the world ends, and I've flown my plane to my survival pad in the South Island of New Zealand. How do I stop my guards from kind of killing me? Kind of stuff. It's again, it sounds very dystopian and it sounds kind of science fiction, but it's actually how many of these rich people are actually thinking about the world, how they can wall themselves off from the problems that they've caused themselves, I suppose. So I think we'll just kind of stop there and use that as a segue into the next part, where we're going to talk with you, Roger, about the super rich.
Fair enough.
Okay, thanks.